Good evening, class. Going to spend just a few minutes with you doing a review for your quiz number 3. Quiz number 3, it's only going to be 10 questions, I think, so might not take too long. But again, I want to make sure that we go through some things that, while it may or may not be on the test, it's going to also help, I guess, drive what we're going to study in the next few chapters. Just remember that employment, it's when people who are willing and able to work can't find a job. That's unemployment. Unemployment is when people who are willing and unable to work can't find a job. And if you think about it, if you look at the economy and unemployment, it's counter-cyclical. So economy goes up, unemployment goes down. Economy goes down, unemployment goes up. It makes sense. And so especially in a, we'll call it a recession, but in a recession or a downturn in the economy, you'll have companies trying to meet payroll. They start laying off people, start hiring freezes, those kind of things. So it makes sense. Remember, counter-cyclical, economy goes up, unemployment goes down. Economy goes down, unemployment goes up. Also, remember the production possibilities curve was based on 3 things. Factors of production are fixed. That's because points outside the curve, it's unattainable. You're looking at full employment of resources and your efficient production process. So if you're on that production possibilities curve, again, you're talking about fixed factors of production, full employment of resources, efficient production processes. And then when we're looking at unemployment, the labor force is made up of those that are employed, those that are unemployed, and to fall in that category of unemployed in the formula for the labor force, you have to be available to work, and they had to have looked for a job, at least well, maybe not even aggressively. They had to put forth the effort to look for a job in the past 4 weeks. And then the last piece is you've got those that aren't in the workforce. So in the workforce or the labor force, you're either employed or you're unemployed. But those not in the labor force are set off to the side. And so if you're calculating the unemployment rate, you're dividing the number of those individuals that are unemployed. And when we say those individuals that are unemployed, we're talking about those that are not holding a job, but have looked for a job in the previous 4 weeks. And so the unemployment rate is the unemployed group divided by the labor force. And remember, the labor force, again, is employed plus unemployed. And when you're trying to calculate those numbers, it's fairly straightforward. Again, unemployment rate, you've got unemployment rate equals unemployment, those unemployed divided by the labor force. Again, what have you got? A ratio. Grab the information you have, again, plug them into those ratios and plug and chug. Issues with actually unemployment rate, you've got part-time employment, you've got underemployment. Part-time is fairly straightforward. Underemployment is an engineer that takes a job as a cook at Waffle House. You've got discouraged workers, those workers that have been trying to find a job and they just say, well, I'm just giving up. And you've got the underground economy, which the underground economy is huge. I think about it here in the Atlanta area, just a huge underground economy. Pool maintenance, landscape, tree services, just a lot of underground employment here, underground economy. And then the authors, again, we've discussed it in one of the other chapters, but they talk about the wage rate, and they have the wage rate, the real wage rate is a Greek letter omega, and it's the nominal wage rate divided by the price level. And so when you're looking at the real wage rate, you're going to plot it on the vertical, and you're going to have the level of employment on the horizontal. Remember, we've been talking about calculating unemployment. Now we're talking about employment. And so, again, real wage rate, level of employment, downward sloping demand, upward sloping supply. If questions are asked, just sit down and map it out, and it makes things pretty clear. And the authors also talk about how to increase the labor force. And when they're talking about how to increase the labor force, they're talking about how to increase the numbers in the labor force. You can get it by relaxing immigration. Well, have we done that over the last 2 years? You can bring back or you can increase the older population that's working, and you see that at least here in Atlanta. I see it everywhere I go, and you will increase the what they call two income families or two household incomes. So, and you see this a lot in healthcare, especially within the nursing workforce. If the economy is plugging along, you know, you just, the economy's plugging along, you'll have nurses, they may go back to work, or the nurses decide, the economy's really good and I've got a partner or spouse that's making a lot of money. I'm just going to hang out. But when the economy really starts crunching along, you'll have not only one partner working, but you'll have maybe the second household income might be a nurse that stayed home to raise kids or wanted to take a little time off just to decompress. And nurses are stressing jobs, so they take some time off periodically to decompress. But you'll start having those two income households start going back into the labor force. Now, what they don't include is when you're trying to include just the gross numbers in the labor force, they don't include the increase to human capital, and that's through training and education. That's where you're increasing the skill set. And if you go back to your old micro class, when you're increasing the level of that skill in that individual FTE or that full-time equivalent worker, you're actually increasing the marginal product of labor. And so that's the goal. That's always been my goal everywhere I've worked, just to focus on that marginal product of labor. And I focus more on the human capital than I do just bringing on more warm bodies. Also, remember that the natural level of employment is considered by most economists as full employment or the equilibrium level of employment. And the natural level of employment is equal to the natural rate of unemployment. Types of unemployment, we've got frictional, structural, cyclical. Frictional, short term usually, just having trouble finding mismatches. You see it a lot, college students. First job out of college, they have a hard time trying to find that right match that they think is going to get them the greatest job that they've ever had. And if it's their first job, maybe it is the greatest job they ever had, but that's typically what you see a lot of frictional unemployment. Structural unemployment, changes in the economy, companies go out of business, companies bring in automation. Those individuals that are displaced may not have the skill level and they may have to go back to school or get another skill. I think you're going to see a lot of this structural unemployment when AI really comes full bore and takes its impact on the working population. And then you've got cyclical. Cyclical you typically see during a recession. You see layoffs, you see hiring freezes. You see it a lot, especially in the healthcare organizations that I've worked for. Plugging along, doing fairly well, comes Thanksgiving. Between Thanksgiving and the first year, they'll start laying people off because they want to make Q4 earnings look good so that when it comes time in Q1 of the next year, they can do the earnings call and talk about how they scale back the staff and how things are more profitable. And you see a lot of times they'll lay people off in that November end of the year time frame and then turn around and hire them back in on Q1. So it's just that's kind of that cyclical place or that cyclical play on the unemployment rate. The natural unemployment rate is calculated as frictional plus structural. The actual unemployment rate frictional plus structural plus cyclical. And so if you do some, kind of math magic and, use some substitution here, then you have the actual unemployment rate is a natural unemployment rate plus cyclical. And again, you're talking about additions. That's your formula. Actual unemployment rate, cyclical, structural, frictional. So I'm sorry, frictional, structural, cyclical. So actual unemployment rate, frictional, structural, plus cyclical. And if there, it's a really, really straightforward process. So, formula, really 4 variables. As long as you know 3 of them, start plugging and chugging. GDP, when we were talking about nominal GDP, it's consumption plus private investment plus government purchases plus net exports. What does aggregate demand measure? Consumption plus investment plus government purchases plus net exports. Looks familiar, right? The individual market demand curve, as we go back to your microeconomics, it slopes downward because of the substitution effect and the income effect. And what happens when you get the aggregate demand curve for an economy, it takes all of these market demand curves and adds them together. However, there is a difference when we're talking about the downward slope. So you've got the income and substitution effect causes the individual demand curve to slope downward. But when you talk about the aggregate demand curve, it slopes downward because of the wealth effect. And again, prices go down, real wealth goes up, and as real wealth goes up, consumer spending typically goes up. Then there's an interest rate effect. Price level goes down, money supply goes down. Remember, we talked about earlier in the class, there's a direct relationship between the price level and the money supply. So price level goes down, money supply goes down, interest rate goes down. What happens to investment? Interest rate goes down, investment pops up. There's an international trade effect. Price level goes down, exports go up, imports go down, so net exports go up. Net exports minus imports get you to your net exports. So price level and interest rates, keep those in mind because they're going to become extremely important going forward in the rest of these chapters. If you decrease the price level, let's go through it again. If you decrease the price level, it decreases the interest rate and it increases the demand for consumption and investment. Why do you think that the government is always so concerned about the price level? Just goes to show you. Keep that inflation rate under control, and you're going to be able to take care of the interest rate, and you're going to be able to drive the demand for consumption and investment. Remember, on the aggregate demand, it's going to slope down just like the individual market, but you're going to map the price level on the vertical, real GDP on the horizontal. In the short run, factors of production are fixed. Short run aggregate supply prices are not fixed, but allowed to be flexible. Make sense? Short run aggregate supply curve, prices are not fixed, but allowed to be flexible. So the aggregate demand curve is sloping downward, aggregate supply curve is sloping upward, and at some point, the long run aggregate supply curve becomes vertical. One thing that we always talk about, whether it's the aggregate demand curve or the aggregate supply curve, movement along either the aggregate demand curve or the aggregate supply curve is driven by a change in price level. A shift in either the aggregate supply curve or an aggregate demand curve is cause the curves either on the demand, it's going to ship right or left. Aggregate supply is going to ship up or down. So price level drives movement along the actual curves, going back to demand and supply shifters. It's a similar concept. It's going to shift those curves, either the aggregate demand up or down, because remember, it slopes downward, or the aggregate supply curve, I call it to the left or to the right. And I think that's going to be it for the review of chapter 3. Pretty simple, pretty easy. That'll take care of chapter. The quiz quiz number 3. And then the next time you see me, we will go through quiz number 4. Thank you.